Hello and welcome to episode 36 of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's topic is the Science-Based Targets Initiative and its draft revision to the corporate net zero standard, which were just updated and made public last week. We hope you didn't think we would go for a light and cheerful topic to close out the summer. Instead, we're diving into the deep end of sustainable governance and corporate regulation, taking a close look at STBi version 2.0 and the fine line between pragmatic target setting and protecting long-term reductions that the net zero carbon emissions goal requires. The Science-Based Targets Initiative has spent the past few years turning lofty corporate climate promises into measurable pathways to reduce our carbon footprint to zero net emissions. This revision redraws where and how companies set ambition, how they track progress, and how they talk about it. Behind the press release headline, there is a substantial shift in architecture and a more deliberate view of accountability. A growing number of companies are reaching the end of their initial target cycle. The spotlight is now on progress achieved rather than ambition declared. That is a timely evolution for a movement that wants to reward outcomes rather than slide decks. There is a new validation model that covers the entire cycle. Companies set targets, then come back for progress assessment, and then set the next round of targets. No more setting once and forgetting. Think of it as passing your exams, showing your report card, and then enrolling for the next course rather than disappearing with the diploma. The new cycle asks firms to disclose how they performed and to renew targets, so the trajectory stays consistent with a net zero world. The aim is continuous improvement. The practical implication is that sustainability teams will spend more time aligning targets with actual delivery and less time debating adjectives. There is also an important change in who must do what. The SBTi revision introduces two company categories. Category A is the home of larger companies and of medium-sized firms in higher income locations. Category B is the home of smaller firms and of medium-sized firms in lower income locations. The intent is to recognise that capacity and context matter. Not every firm has the same data systems, the same access to capital, or the same leverage over suppliers. This is a standards body acknowledging economics and geography. It is also a signal that leadership should lean in where it has the means. Category A companies carry the heavier pack. They must set near-term targets for Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Just to clarify, Scope 1 emissions are the direct greenhouse gases released from sources a company owns or controls, such as fuel burned in on-site boilers, company vehicles, industrial processes, and refrigerant leaks. Scope 2 emissions are indirect and come from the generation of electricity, steam, heating, or cooling that the company purchases and consumes, which can be reported on a location-based or market-based basis. Scope 3 emissions include all other indirect releases across the value chain, both upstream and downstream, from purchased goods and services, capital goods, transport and distribution, business travel, employee commuting, and the use and end of life of sold products. In short, Scope 1 sits within operational control, Scope 2 arises from energy procurement, and Scope 3 reflects broader supplier and customer impacts. So, these Category A companies must set long-term targets for Scope 1 and Scope 2. The long-term treatment of Scope 3 is still being consulted. We will come back to that because it sits at the heart of the tension between pragmatism and ambition. Category B companies receive a lighter burden focused on near-term Scope 1 and Scope 2. That simplification is meant to bring more firms into the tent and get real reductions moving in places where capacity is thinner. There is a logic here, although it is far from straightforward. Asking less from the smallest actors today can still get more decarbonisation done if it allows large buyers to channel resources and support down their chains. Whether that logic holds will depend on how Category A firms choose to use their influence. The second headline is Scope 3, where most of the emissions live and where many targets go to retire after a long career in procurement policy. The old rule of thumb was a fixed percentage: cover 2/3 of Scope 3 in the near term and cover 9/10 in the long term. The revision pivots away from a fixed boundary and toward relevance. Do not chase an arbitrary fraction. Go after the biggest drivers in your value chain and the activities where you have meaningful influence. That means prioritizing emissions-intensive activities and prioritizing the suppliers and customer uses where decisions you make can actually move the needle. It also moves some attention onto metrics that track alignment rather than only tons reduced. The share of spend with suppliers who are aligned with net zero pathways, the share of revenue from net zero aligned products and services. The idea is to measure the conditions that create reductions, not only the reductions themselves. If you change who you buy from and what you sell, the emissions follow. This is the point where procurement takes centre stage. A near-term Scope 3 target that focuses on supplier alignment sounds less romantic than a single sweeping intensity curve. It is much more practical. It aligns with how companies influence value chains. It also aligns with investing in supplier programs that change actual equipment and processes rather than only policies. You do not move emissions in a spinning mill or a steel mini mill with a sentence in a sustainability report. You move them when you underwrite a power purchase agreement, or fund an electrified process heat retrofit, or make offtake contingent on clear milestones. Targets that talk to that reality are healthy targets. The revision also introduces the concept of activity pools and opens a cautious lane for indirect mitigation where traceability is not yet possible. Activity pools are a structured way of saying we know the shed of suppliers or assets that feed us, even if we cannot pin each molecule of emissions to a specific site today. Think of a supply shed for a commodity or a regional power pool that feeds manufacturing. If you cannot trace to the source, the framework allows you to act at the pool level and to count that action toward progress, provided the intervention is material and the chain of custody is credible. On Scope 2, there is a dual requirement. Companies will be expected to set a location-based target and a procurement-based target. The procurement side can be met with a market-based Scope 2 target or with a zero-carbon electricity target. The standards go further and raise the bar on the quality of energy certificates. Spatial matching and time matching appear with intent. The signal is clear. If you want to claim progress through certificates, source power in the same grid and on timelines that reflect the real operation of the grid. Many firms will translate that into more physical or virtual power purchase agreements, more on-site generation, and tighter claims rules for residual certificate purchases. Finance teams will discover that electricity certificates can be like apples. The fresh local ones carry more nutrition than the crate that arrived last year from somewhere far away. The SBTi revision also tightens the treatment of residual emissions. The old world waited until the net zero year to neutralise residuals. The new draft outlines options that bring responsibility for residuals forward in time, introduces interim removal milestones, and adds a conversation about durability. Like-for-like permanence is one option. A ladder that increases durability over time is another. Either way, the message is that you plan for residuals early, you scale removals in a way that is consistent with science, and you treat removals as a complement to deep abatement rather than a substitute. That distinction will matter greatly for credibility and for investment signals. It will also matter for finance because the cost and the risk profile of removal portfolios are not trivial. Claims receive a much-needed update as well. The standard clarifies what companies can say before initial validation, after initial validation, and after renewal. There are rules around the evidence required to make those claims and the maturity of the actions behind them. This will be welcome news to communications teams, who tend to discover that 3 words on a website attract as much scrutiny as 300 pages of technical annexes. The revision aims to reduce the gap between reality and marketing by naming the claims that match specific milestones. That is good discipline for everyone. Now, to the core tension in the consultation, the long-term treatment of Scope 3. Many commentators worry that easing the formal requirement to set long-term Scope 3 targets would weaken ambition. The counterpoint is that the near-term requirements are stronger and more aligned with how change actually happens across supply chains. Uncomfortable truth sits in the middle. Scope 3 is where many companies hold most of their emissions. It is also where measurement is hardest and control weakest. The draft invites firms to keep meaningful Scope 3 action on the near-term docket and to show supplier alignment and product alignment. Those are engines of transformation. The draft also proposes that all companies publish a transition plan within a year of validation. That will keep long-term value chain reductions firmly on the planning table, even where a separate long-term Scope 3 target is not mandatory. Our view for a sophisticated audience is straightforward. If you are a Category A company, treat long-term Scope 3 as essential, regardless of whether it becomes mandatory. A credible transition plan without a long-term view of your value chain is a plan with blank pages. You need to understand when use phase emissions will decline as product lines change, when materials switch to lower carbon intensity, when logistics decarbonizes, and when suppliers reach their own targets. You also need to pace capital allocation and supplier contracts to those milestones. A long-term Scope 3 target is not a trophy on the wall. It is a metronome for decision-making across the business. If you are a Category B company, the revision gives you room to focus on the emissions you control and to build capability. Use that room to improve data quality, to clean up your energy mix, and to pilot Scope 3 actions where they are feasible. Seek support from your larger customers. Many Category A firms will need you to move, and the standard explicitly encourages them to help. Treat that as an opportunity to secure better terms and co-investment for decarbonisation. There is a strategic play here for medium-sized firms in lower-income locations. Early movers can become preferred suppliers in global value chains that are under pressure to demonstrate progress. There is an equally pragmatic thread on data and assurance. Category A firms are expected to obtain limited third-party assurance on their base year inventory. That will create useful friction. Data systems will need to catch up with ambition. Expect to see more investment in product-level footprints, supplier data platforms, and traceability systems that can support the activity pool concept. If you want to claim progress, you will have to show the chain of custody for the interventions that sit behind the claim. That means purchase orders, contract clauses, certificate registries, and metering data rather than only a policy statement. It also means fewer hours debating whether a spreadsheet is accurate, and more hours ensuring that invoices reflect the emissions reality. The modifications for Scope 2 will also push procurement into new territory. A dual target structure means you cannot rely entirely on market-based claims in a distant grid. You will need a location-based story that matches your operating footprint, and you will need a procurement story that reflects real additionality. Expect to see stronger auctions for clean power, more aggregation of demand, and more firms accepting that grid decarbonisation is not someone else's job. When you buy power in a way that changes the grid, you are not only meeting a target, you are moving the system you operate in. Let us talk about indirect mitigation and certificates in a more practical tone. The language in the draft is careful for good reason. There is wide variation in the quality of certificates across electricity, fuels, and commodities. There is also wide variation in their treatment in claims and accounting. The standard's direction of travel is to recognize indirect mitigation where it is the only credible path for a period, and only when it drives outcomes that are comparable to direct mitigation. That makes sense for things like sustainable aviation fuel certificates for business travel or freight, where physical delivery is not yet possible at scale. It also makes sense for commodity chains, where fully segregated supply is not commercially available. The risk to manage is overclaiming. If a certificate solves a real barrier and accelerates real transformation in your value chain, it deserves a place. If a certificate allows you to avoid doing the hard work where you do have control, do not expect applause. There is also a signal to financial markets in all of this. The new model places a premium on delivery and on transparent claims. Investors and lenders who are updating their own net zero frameworks will find this helpful. It gives them a better way to interrogate whether a portfolio company is genuinely aligned or only fluent in the vocabulary. It also gives them a better sense of when capital needs to move. Interim removal milestones, traceability plans, supplier engagement metrics, and dual scope 2 targets are all checkable. Decision useful, as the auditors say. How does Synergy International suggest a company respond in practice? Start with 3 time horizons. In the next 12 months, tighten your base year, get assurance where required, set the dual scope 2 targets, map your scope 3 hotspots by activity and by supplier tier, and commit to a transition plan that includes the value chain. Do not postpone the conversation about residuals. Catalogue where residuals are likely to remain by the net zero year and draft a removal strategy with interim milestones. In the next 3 years, hardwire your supplier engagement into contracting, budgeting, and board reporting. Use alignment metrics with teeth. Require suppliers to set their own science-based targets and provide support so that request is realistic. Shift the product portfolio toward low-carbon revenue in a way that sales, design, and finance all understand. In the next 5 to 10 years, manage the glide path. Revisit targets at the end of the cycle, lock in the next round, and keep the metronome steady. It is astonishing how much can be done by doing the next sensible thing consistently. Let us ground this in 3 quick scenarios. A global chemicals company in Category A faces large Scope 1 and Scope 2 footprints and a complex Scope 3 profile. Its plan sets long-term Scope 1 and 2 targets aligned with the Paris Agreement goal to limit the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. A near-term Scope 3 target then focuses on supplier alignment in feedstocks and energy, and a transition plan that sequences abatement at crackers and process heat before turning to removals for residuals in the target year. It revises its power buying to meet both location-based and procurement-based goals with time-matched purchases, and it pilots activity pool interventions in key commodity chains where segregation is not yet feasible. In this world, the new standard simply accelerates sensible moves it was making already. A medium-sized manufacturer in a lower-income location sits in Category B. It sets near-term Scope 1 and 2 targets, improves its inventory quality, and shifts to cleaner power where possible. It partners with its largest customers on equipment upgrades and on supplier capability building. It does not set a formal Scope 3 target in the first cycle, although it chooses to track a few alignment metrics for its own management. That still moves meaningful tons because the facilities under its roof are where its levers live today. The door remains open to expand Scope 3 action in the next cycle. A fast-growing digital services firm in Category A has modest Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions and an outsized Scope 3 footprint in purchased goods and services, capital goods, travel, and the use of data-intensive services. It sets dual Scope 2 targets to align its data center procurement with what runs on its networks, and it sets a near-term Scope 3 plan that focuses on supplier alignment across software, hardware, and co-location. It takes a conservative stance on certificates, using them only where direct or activity pool interventions are not possible. It adds internal carbon pricing to steer product choices toward lower energy intensity and commits to long-term Scope 3, even if not mandated. In a sector where scope inflation can be spectacular, credible boundaries and credible claims become the differentiator. In a world where climate science is not negotiating with us, the destination still matters most. The revision keeps the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 Celsius as the central ambition, although climate evidence shows this threshold has already been breached during record-breaking heatwave summer months. It asks for better progress tracking. It asks for tighter claims. It asks for responsibility for residuals earlier than before. And it allows a measure of flexibility to reflect the reality of complex value chains and the diversity of company contexts. That combination is realistic. It will only be rigorous if companies choose to keep the long view, even where the letter of the requirement allows a shortcut. Pragmatism in corporate decarbonisation is about speed and scale, not about excuses. Safeguarding long-term reductions is about planning and discipline, not about slogans. The draft revision can support both goals when companies commit to the spirit as well as the letter. There is work to do on the details through consultation and pilot testing. There is also work to do inside companies tomorrow morning. Well, that's a wrap on our 36th GreenWave podcast episode. We appreciate you sharing your time with us on each episode. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. And feel free to follow the pod and share with friends. Not only do we love when you leave a review, it makes us happier still when it's a 5-star version. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette, you can always catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.